Good evening. Welcome. My name is Amy Godion, and on behalf of Dean McConaughey and the faculty, staff, and students, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Lewis Katz Hall this evening for the annual Omar Bradley Chair Lecture. Tonight's program will feature former Assistant Secretary of State Philip J. Crowley, who will speak on the topic of WikiLeaks 1 year after its most ambitious document releases, the Iraq War Logs release of 400,000 military records, and the Cablegate release of 250,000 diplomatic and embassy cables. This evening's program is co-sponsored by the United States Army War College, the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College, and the Penn State Journal of Law and International Affairs, a joint publication of the university's School of International Affairs and Dickinson School of Law. At this time, I would like to recognize some of the distinguished guests joining us this evening. First, Dickinson College Provost Neil Weissman, and also, yes, there you go, Dickinson College students. And also issue a very warm welcome to the students and faculty from Dickinson College and the Army War College. The format this evening will include remarks by Mr. Crowley, followed by a question and answer session. During the question and answer session, please line up behind the microphone presented here, or if you are in University Park, please press your button, as you are accustomed to doing. At the conclusion of the question and answer session, I invite you to join us for a small reception in the Commons area. Finally, please note that this event in its entirety is being simulcast to University Park, being broadcast live via the web, and being recorded for future use. Admittedly, my role here tonight is a minor one. However, I beg your indulgence for a few moments as I attempt to give some context to the topic and also to the forum in which tonight's program will occur, before I introduce our very distinguished speaker. First, the topic. WikiLeaks and the security transparency matrix it represents has captured the public's attention. As you likely know, WikiLeaks is a nonprofit media organization. It was formally launched in 2007 by a group of internet activists. It set as its mission the importance of bringing news and information to the public by providing a secure and anonymous way for sources to leak information to journalists. Its founders tout the importance of principled leaking. Now, under this construct, transparency is the key ingredient in creating better government and a better society for all people. As proclaimed on the organization's website, quote, "The public scrutiny of otherwise unaccountable and secretive institutions forces them to consider the ethical implications of their actions. Better scrutiny leads to reduced corruption and stronger democracies in all society's institutions, including government, corporations, and other organizations. A healthy, vibrant, and inquisitive journalistic media plays a vital role in achieving these goals." End quote. Since its inception, WikiLeaks has released significant quantities of secret U.S. military and diplomatic documents. But arguably the most prominent releases, or dumps, occurred in October 2010, when it released close to 400,000 reports on the Iraq War, and in November 2010, when it released 250,000 diplomatic cables. Despite the lofty goals to which the founders of WikiLeaks claim homage, the organization has critics. Representatives of the government, military, and diplomatic corps, both in the United States and throughout the world, have accused the organization of aiding terrorists, compromising national security interests, endangering the lives of military, diplomatic, and intelligence personnel, as well as innocent civilians. It has been called a criminal enterprise, and some have even called for the U.S. government to employ intelligence and military assets to bring the founders to justice and to take the organization down. In addition, human rights groups, arguably potential allies in the cause WikiLeaks purports to serve, have criticized the organization. In 2010, Amnesty International and 4 other groups sent a letter urging WikiLeaks to do a better job of redacting names from thousands of war documents it was publishing. The impetus for the plea was concern that the method of publishing could jeopardize the safety of Afghans who were assisting the U.S. military at the time. Just yesterday, Julian Assange, one of the founders of WikiLeaks, stated that the organization's website may be forced to shut down by the end of the year. He cited two reasons for the likely shutdown. First, the financial blockade, which has sharply reduced the donations on which the organization depends. And second, the need to focus the organization's remaining resources on the lawsuits it is pursuing in the United States, Australia, and elsewhere. At the news conference yesterday, Mr. Assange accused the U.S. Treasury, American intelligence agencies, and other political forces in the United States of a conspiracy to smear and destroy him and WikiLeaks. Now for the second item that I wanted to approach, the forum for this program. And by forum, I mean the manner in which this program came about. As I mentioned earlier, this event is jointly sponsored by the United States Army War College, Dickinson College, and the School of International Affairs and the Dickinson School of Law. It is an outreach or outgrowth of collaborative efforts among the three institutions of higher learning, one military and two civilian. And the topic for this program came about as a result of the experiences of the current occupant of the Bradley Chair in Strategic Leadership. That chair was founded in honor of General Omar Nelson Bradley, who served as one of the main U.S. Army field commanders in North Africa and Europe during World War II, and as the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was established in his name to promote the study of leadership in the context of security and strategy, and to do so in a way that incorporated the liberal arts perspective in that course of study. The founders identified a joint faculty chair, one shared between civilian and military academies, and one with the expectation that its holders would contribute to both the research and educational missions of the institution, as an effective vehicle for enhancing civilian and military dialogue. The value of building these educational bridges is not merely so that academics, regardless of whether they teach in a military or civilian academy, can feel good about what they do. The value is in the positive gains that are achieved when our military personnel and our civilians work together to deploy military, diplomatic, and economic power in a manner that is consistent with U.S. interests and U.S. values. WikiLeaks is a superb vehicle for these types of discussions, and I am confident that the program this evening will be provocative and will inspire probing questions and robust debate, and will serve as an apt example of the types of interactions that General Bradley sought to foster. Philip J. Crowley, PJ, is the 2011-2012 Omar Bradley Chair in Strategic Leadership. President Barack Obama nominated, and the United States Senate confirmed Mr. Crowley to be Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs in the Department of State in 2009. He served in that position and as a spokesman for the department until his resignation in March 2011. During that time, he was the primary U.S. government contact with major media regarding the release of classified diplomatic cables by WikiLeaks. Before joining the Obama administration, Mr. Crowley was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, with a particular focus on homeland security in the aftermath of 9/11. He authored several national security studies, including Safe at Home, a detailed homeland security strategy to protect the American homeland, improve national preparedness, and rebuild U.S. standing in the world. He remains engaged in these issues as a participant in the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Crowley served as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director of Public Affairs for the National Security Council, among other roles. Mr. Crowley is a 26-year veteran of the United States Air Force, including tours in Turkey, Germany, and the United States Air Force Academy. He is a veteran of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm and Operation Provide Comfort. During the Kosovo conflict, he worked under Javier Solana, the Secretary General of NATO, helping to develop a strategic communication capability to sustain public support for the NATO campaign. He retired from the Air Force in 1999 as a colonel. He currently serves as a fellow at the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication within the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. His research and teaching interests focus on national security policy, public diplomacy, and the impact of the global media environment on conflict, policy, and politics. He appears frequently as a national security commentator on global television networks and local radio stations, if you happen to be listening to Smart Talk this morning at 9 a.m., including as a contributor to Al Jazeera English and the BBC. He is also a regular columnist for the Daily Beast and can be followed on Twitter. A native of Massachusetts, Mr. Crowley is a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross and a long-suffering Red Sox fan. It is my very great pleasure to introduce this year's Omar N. Bradley Chair in Strategic Leadership.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, until recently, as you heard, I worked for that secretive organization, so I plead guilty. Amy, thank you very much. Just to tell you of Amy's incredible attention to detail, we scheduled this lecture months ago, and it falls on an off day of the World Series. Now, Amy comes from a Phillies family. I come from a Red Sox family. There was a time back in August where we thought there might be a Red Sox-Phillies World Series. If that had happened, it was possible that neither of us would be here tonight. Amy would have arranged for a pinch hitter to introduce the Bradley lecture, and I would have arranged a relief pitcher to give the speech. As we say in Boston, wait till next year. Well, good evening to those of you in Carlisle, in University Park, and watching on the internet. My wife, Paula Kuchis, is in the audience, the other colonel in the family, and we are delighted to be part of the Carlisle community and part of this wonderful group of distinguished academic institutions, the Penn State Dickinson School of Law and School of International Affairs, Dickinson College, and the Army War College. I would say even our dog, Zeke, is enjoying the change of scenery. He starts lurking at the door in our house near Washington, D.C. every Sunday afternoon, waiting for our weekly road trip. And he has embraced the academic experience, regularly contemplating the existential meaning of the rabbit that frequently camps out in the front yard at the guest house on West Lowther. I told one of my former colleagues at the State Department recently that if I had known that teaching was this rewarding, developing a new course here in Carlisle on national security policy in the 21st century global media environment, I would have entered academia a long time ago. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, the students of my Dickinson seminar are also here tonight. Some of them are right there. They are free during the Q&A to offer a rebuttal regarding the course so far. I have no doubt that several of them have already sent tweets about the program, and given their considerable talent and confidence, some of them might even give a press conference after the speech. Now, we have set up a course blog called the Carlisle Policy Forum. We are connected via Twitter at Carlisle Policy, engaging through social media even as we study the impact of social media on the global security environment. All of you are welcome to join in. Now, just to be clear, I had no grand plan when I uttered 3 infamous words at a seminar at MIT back in March. I was asked a straightforward question and simply felt it deserved an honest answer. I thought that the actions of my government were, well, ridiculous, counterproductive, and stupid. Casting doubt on the United States' commitment to international standards of justice and human rights, and undermining the credibility of an important and still pending legal case. The Army has wisely made an adjustment, and Bradley Manning has since been moved to a more appropriate facility that meets normal standards of pretrial confinement. But that moment led to this opportunity, and we could not be more pleased to be here. But I thought it would be useful to reflect on the past year or so, what happened with WikiLeaks and its aftermath, but more importantly to consider the implications of some of the vitally important issues associated with the release of just under 750,000 documents, many of them classified and highly sensitive. Now, mention the word WikiLeaks, and it triggers various issues, including freedom of the press, whistleblowing, secrecy, and transparency. I will spend a few minutes on each issue. But first, to set the stage, we live in what Tom Friedman and Michael Mandelbaum in their new book have termed a hyper-connected world, the consequence of globalization and one or more information revolutions that continue to reshape the nature of power, international relations, and global politics. For the past 70 years, we have built an extraordinary open and liberal global system. John Eikenberry of Princeton has an excellent new book out that charts this progress, and the United States is at the core of this system. We have become interconnected and interdependent through a web of bilateral relationships, multilateral alliances, international institutions, and also global communication networks. And given the expanding reach of media, both traditional and now social media, public opinion has, as we have seen most recently with the ongoing Arab transitions, become increasingly important in the conduct of foreign policy. Now, some presidential candidates keep talking about building fences around America, but the connections and the flow of information and knowledge are ever expanding. What happens somewhere else is global news within minutes. What happens here is as well. It's a global stage, and more people now have a front row seat. So when one candidate comments on Uzbeki, Becky, Stan, I think I got that right. The people and leaders of Uzbekistan notice and react. In truth, the divide between what is domestic and what is international has disappeared. In a world that is becoming increasingly transparent, the centers of gravity are civilian populations, protecting them, engaging them, understanding their history, their culture, their structure, and their politics, what worries them, what inspires them, what they want and what they need, what they think and what they do, what they think of the United States and what they hope to see from us and perceive about us. Modern conflict, as General Rupert Smith suggests, is now war amongst the people. If we are viewed as defending them from violence as part of a shared struggle, as was the case recently in Libya, those operations will be viewed as legitimate. If our actions are viewed as precipitating violence without international support, as was the case in Iraq, we will face an uphill challenge to gain and sustain public support, both domestic and foreign, necessary to succeed. Whether these perceptions are fair or unfair, they cannot be ignored. In the context of combating terrorism, this is now a conflict not only among the people, but about the people. The competition about hearts, minds, and ideas, how we govern ourselves, how we define ourselves, and how we affect change across communities and countries. Our ability to pursue our national interests will increasingly require international cooperation and understanding. Now, public opinion polls have stabilized in recent years, but international concerns about U.S. policies remain. There's a fairly substantial gap between what we try to do and how others perceive our actions. Needless to say, the current financial crisis, which did start here, impacts U.S. leadership even today. It is within this context that our diplomats around the world are engaged on a routine basis with leaders, government officials, activists, citizens, and journalists to gain a better understanding of the global security environment. This environment includes an array of rising powers, non-state actors, and niche players, perhaps call them micro actors. And for the past few years, WikiLeaks has been one of them. At the State Department, having already observed, as Amy said, a series of disclosures about documents at the Pentagon regarding Afghanistan and Iraq, we expected WikiLeaks to have a significant impact for some time, and it did. And given the spread of the database combined with high-speed search capability. It will be a part of the background noise on various issues for the foreseeable future. But at the same time, the sky did not fall either. And as a government, we never said it would. We condemned the disclosure, I condemned the disclosure, and were then criticized for overreacting. We said it would complicate international relations, and it's safe to say that it has. We never said it would cripple our relationships with other countries, and thankfully, it has not. At the State Department, we understood that over weeks, months, and years, depending on the country, common interests that drive international relations would rise above personalities and even political pique. You see that obviously in the significant regional cooperation regarding the unprecedented events unfolding in the Middle East, including Libya. There was a great deal of hard work over months after these documents were released to mitigate any long-term impact between Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her able deputy Bill Burns, who's got close ties to the community here in Carlisle. The two of them have probably talked to every president, king, prime minister, and foreign minister with whom we have diplomatic relations. I think the secretary, my former boss, would say that some of those conversations were colorful, others truly unpleasant. Now, among professional diplomats who understood the practice of the diplomatic arts in the context of these documents, business continues to get done. As one foreign minister told the secretary, "Don't worry about it, Hillary. You should see what we write about you guys." Nonetheless, there have been diplomatic casualties. A good friend of mine, our former ambassador to Mexico, being one of them. Now, Bill Keller, the former managing editor of the New York Times, in his account of WikiLeaks, quoted Max Frankel, the Times' former Washington bureau chief, who said, quote, "When the government loses a secret or two, it simply adjusts to a new reality." Now, Max Frankel said that in the context of the Pentagon Papers. But what happened with WikiLeaks was fundamentally different. A scale and a scope that distinguishes WikiLeaks from any other precedent. Think about it. 91,000 documents regarding the Afghan war, 392,000 documents regarding the Iraq war, 251,000 documents regarding the State Department. The size of the archive was larger than any one person could understand, much less absorb. Even WikiLeaks and Julian Assange struggled to manage the database. Now, by contrast, previous leaks usually involve a handful of documents or secrets in one country or one issue, as opposed to materials involving two active military campaigns and literally every bilateral relationship the United States has around the world. Now, at the State Department, there were three broad areas of concern. The first was the potential impact on critical relationships between the United States and other countries. And there have been specific negative impacts that have retarded the pursuit of shared interests. The release of the documents undermined a sense of trust that is the bedrock of effective relationships. It's hard to isolate what happened with WikiLeaks from other sources of tension that exist in various relationships, perhaps below the surface. For example, as an illustration, Saudi Arabia, or a tension that is clearly out in the open, as with Pakistan. Both are strategic countries, and WikiLeaks produced added strains that will influence relations for some time. The second concern was the lives and livelihoods of people. Other government officials, activists, academics, citizens, even an occasional journalist who had talked to a U.S. diplomat sometime in the past. People have been placed in jeopardy. The United States has assisted various officials and individuals in relocating within autocratic societies to safer ground as a result of these compromised cables. Have people cited in these cables been physically harmed for what they are doing, including their interactions with U.S. diplomats? The answer is yes. And the risk of these individuals continues to rise, given the recent release of the entire archive of documents. The government as I understand it, continues to monitor a large number of cases and has interceded repeatedly when individuals cited in these documents have been threatened and detained. In this category, the fears that we had have been fully realized and then some. The third was the impact on future statecraft. The existence of what's called the Net-Centric Database, or NCD, existed specifically to share information more broadly across the government in the aftermath of 9/11. And there remains a risk that information will be pushed back into agency silos, either through reduced circulation of cable traffic, and that has already occurred. The State Department has pulled cables off of one of the two classified networks that supported the NCD, or through a use of more narrow reporting channels. For example, an ambassador sending less formal detail in cables themselves and communicating more insights via phone or email. The good news is that means our policies are still being formed, but the bad news is that means that the information that was widely available across the government is now, once again, more narrowly contained. Now, regarding these documents, are there legitimate questions about the conduct of U.S. policy in specific locations? Absolutely. Questions about the willingness of the leader of another country to deceive his own people about the nature of joint counterterrorism operations with at least the tacit agreement of U.S. officials raise the risk of deceiving the American people in the process. But on the other side of the ledger rests a deep record of effective diplomacy in pursuit of U.S. national interests and shared international interests consistent with our policies, our laws, and our values. Now, as a movement, WikiLeaks' ability to captivate is not unprecedented. The global campaign to ban landmines in the late 1990s yielded an important international treaty and earned the Nobel Peace Prize. WikiLeaks helped produce headlines, but it may actually not survive, as Amy just said, its own internal conflicts and contradictions, and it has also been victimized by its own leaks. Now, some who worked on WikiLeaks have formed a new entity with a similar purpose, so whether WikiLeaks continues, others will step forward to replicate it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the phenomenon of WikiLeaks and the reaction of the U.S. government has been interpreted through a variety of lenses, and let me touch on a few of those areas. The first is the question of freedom of the press. Now, criticism of Julian Assange in this country and the ongoing investigation by the Department of Justice have led some to question the U.S. commitment to freedom of the press. I think these concerns are misplaced. Globally, there is no greater supporter of freedom of the press and the important role of its important role in sustaining a civil society than the United States. On a regular basis from the State Department podium, I would challenge attempts in autocratic countries to intimidate or injure journalists working to hold government to account. Russia would be a prime example. Now, the United States government, myself included, criticized the full disclosure of classified information, but never questioned the right of major news outlets, such as the New York Times, to publish stories about this material. Now, unlike the Pentagon Papers case, where the government sought an injunction to preempt publication, an issue settled in the Supreme Court in New York Times versus United States, our concern was exclusively what was published, not the right to publish. Now, in my view, the media has played its assigned role within our democracy, reporting carefully and credibly on the material that we actually wish they never had. Now, the diplomats who wrote some of the cables have been saluted as excellent reporters in their own right. The author of the infamous Dagestan wedding cable was especially popular among cable critics. But the mainstream media did help to provide needed context and perspective as this information emerged publicly. Now, everyone has their favorite cable. Mine involves the Ukrainian nurse and the late Mr. Gaddafi. But at the end of the day, there were not that many startling headlines. As Bill Keller of the Times wrote, the documents advanced the public's knowledge of the world not in great leaps, but in small degrees. Now, it's also worth noting that countries where there is no freedom of the press, there was actually no reaction at all. And that reinforces the importance of a vigorous and independent media. Now, recently, WikiLeaks pushed out the entire archive on the internet, failing to redact the identities of the department's pledge of strictly protect this person or that person. In contrast, the media recognized the danger of forced transparency, as the Guardian editor David Lee described it, understanding that in this process there are costs and risks. The Times and other outlets went to great lengths to make responsible judgments about what to publish and what not to publish. And my conversations with them through several weeks were strictly about those kinds of issues. Now, within the government, we were placed in an awkward position of trying to help the media understand the context behind the cables without getting into a specific discussion about any particular cable, which, in this case, to this day, these cables are still classified. And we were reassured that the Times and other outlets were focused on the importance of specific intelligence cooperation that, if compromised, might put crucial interests at risk. And at our request, they actually did not report on certain matters that were contained in these cables. It is this contrast of roles, the mainstream media recognizing the potential risk of disclosure versus the philosophy of radical transparency, that distinguishes journalists from activists. Now, in a functioning democracy, we need both. But the mere operation of a website does not make a political actor like Julian Assange a journalist. The media rightly viewed him as a source with his own agenda. Now, that said, it is virtually impossible to separate Julian Assange's actions from journalists who do enjoy First Amendment protections. I'm not a lawyer, but even though it appears plausible in the abstract that a legal case could be made against Julian Assange under existing law, I believe the costs of such a prosecution far outweigh the potential benefits. The ability of the United States to continue to urge other countries, such as Russia or China, that routinely intimidate, jail, or injure journalists and activists, to encourage them to abide by international norms, that ability would be severely compromised if we choose to prosecute Julian Assange. The power of our example and our voice to continue to promote freedom of the press and freedom of expression are far more important than this one case. Julian Assange faces his own personal legal issues in Europe, but should not face prosecution here in the United States. Legal action, to me, should remain focused on the individual accused of violating his oath of office. That is a crime under U.S. law and merits prosecution. A second area involves whistleblowing. There are many people who view Bradley Manning as a whistleblower. Earlier this year, I was on a panel at the Columbia Journalism School in New York, and one of my co-panelists described the release as industrial whistleblowing. I'm still trying to get my arms around this concept, which I think suffers from an internal contradiction. I do not see WikiLeaks as a case of whistleblowing for a number of reasons, most importantly, its scale. Remember the number of documents involved, almost 750,000 documents reflecting virtually everything the United States does anywhere in the world. To the extent whistleblowing is about exposing wrongdoing of policies or actions that merit greater scrutiny, then the assumption must be that the United States policies in the world are wrong, all of them wrong. That, to me, is simply an argument that is not credible. Again, I am not suggesting that the United States is above reproach, but whether or not we can point to a specific national security harm, the fact that it has not had a debilitating effect that might have been feared should not be interpreted to mean that this was not, as the Vice President might say, a big deal. It remains a big deal and will continue to pose risks to our national interest for some time. To me, central to the concept of whistleblowing is both expertise in the subject matter and a sense that in releasing certain information, the benefits outweigh the risks associated with the leak. Daniel Ellsberg, the best modern-day manifestation of a whistleblower, worked directly on the analysis that detailed a flawed strategy in Vietnam. He attempted to work within the system, but in the end he felt he had no choice but to expose the report that he earnestly felt could change policy. More recently, there's the case of Thomas Drake, a former employee at the National Security Agency. That case raises difficult questions. Based on a profile in the New Yorker, there are strong reasons to consider Thomas Drake a whistleblower. As an American, I am uncomfortable that he has been tried under the Espionage Act. He was acquitted, for merely talking to a journalist about a sensitive issue, a matter that he and others brought to the attention of Congress as well. But while there are very legitimate, necessary roles played by whistleblowers in our society, WikiLeaks is different. Now, as to the matter of secrecy, are there too many secrets? The answer is probably, or undoubtedly, yes. But this, to me, is the wrong question. Take one of the cables that received more attention than most. A number of stories quoted an exchange between a Gulf monarch and a high-level U.S. government official. Now, mind you, the trip in question was public knowledge. It is well known that the Gulf monarchies are greatly concerned about a more ambitious and assertive Iran. The discussion involved whether sanctions would convince Iran to change course regarding its nuclear program. The king's view was clear. This would ultimately require military action, and the sooner the better. But here's the fundamental question. Should conversations like that be confidential? To me, the answer is yes. A number of diplomatic secrets has gone up, but not necessarily because the United States has become more secretive. For one thing, there are simply more countries. The United Nations added its 193rd member this year, South Sudan. By comparison, the UN Charter was ratified by only 50 countries. There are more diplomatic conversations occurring on more issues. The definition of national security has broadened. It's no longer a matter of just diplomats and soldiers. A great deal of the daily interaction among government representatives regards the global economy, the environment, energy, human rights, and many other subjects. At the State Department, and similarly when I worked at the White House and Pentagon, I had two computers on my desk, one connected to an unclassified network and the other to a classified network. I would go back and forth between the two systems depending on the issue and the classification. If I was trying to determine the facts about a sensitive issue and what could be said publicly about it, that exchange might generate a series of emails, now all classified records. Thus, more stuff. The State Department alone generates 1 million cables a year and 1 billion emails a year. And the State Department is a small agency. In the national security world, broad categories of activity should be properly restricted. Most advocates of more transparent government recognize this. Military operations, weapon capabilities, intelligence operations, diplomatic communications, and critical infrastructure would be good examples. Businesses have proprietary information that is also crucial to maintaining a critical advantage. Coca-Cola has its secret formula. Google, its secret algorithm. Governments, up to a point, are no different. A democracy with no secrets is a society that will rapidly cease to function. Naked transparency, as Lawrence Lessig wrote not long ago in The New Republic, would push our political system off a cliff. But there must be a balance, which leads us to the issue of transparency. Now, we've identified this zone of confidentiality, as I would call it, that pertains to national security, where governments should be given some latitude to conduct diplomacy, plan, and execute military operations. But next to this classified cloud, if you will, there must be a corresponding space, call it a zone of accountability, that ensures citizens are properly informed about the actions of government, that subjects government to genuine oversight and curtails potential government abuse. In terms of government transparency, we are good, but we can do better. At a certain level, the United States is transparent. Now, depending on how you view the tweets of elected officials, past and present, perhaps too transparent. And in one particular district, there have been dramatic political consequences. We do have to keep in mind that openness does not always lead to effectiveness. There are many reasons why Congress has ceased to function in recent years. Television may actually be a contributing factor. as members of the House and Senate talk past each other to the cameras rather than to each other to legislate and achieve principled compromise. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that we take C-SPAN out of those chambers. My 90-year-old father-in-law is a devoted viewer. Now, I get extra points if I include my father-in-law in speeches. But it is also to say that the proverbial smoke-filled room, smoke-filled rooms, they do have their purpose as long as they are combined with other efforts that reveal who else is trying to influence legislation. With all the money flowing through our political system, people are losing trust in their elected leaders. The recent hemorrhaging of our political strength, elected officials trying to shut down our government or send us into default, even as we witness the remarkable events of the Middle East and North Africa, jeopardizes our position as a global leader. But since 9/11, there has been a discernible push towards less government transparency, reduced oversight, even less public debate about critical security issues. We've seen information removed from public websites based on a concern, again legitimate up to a point, that information can potentially be used by those seeking to harm us. Critical infrastructure is an excellent example, and in fact there was one cable analyzing global critical infrastructure that was one of the most sensitive documents released by WikiLeaks. Again, we have to return to an appropriate balance. There are ways in which government can encourage and participate in a robust debate about policies and actions while protecting those details that are truly sensitive. There are many institutional steps that we can take, strengthen the role of oversight bodies within government, declassifying information more rapidly, perhaps in 10 years rather than the current 25-year standard. Government can improve its responsiveness to freedom of information requests. Some of those steps are already being done under an open government initiative, but again, we can do better. A good example would be greater openness regarding counterterrorism operations. In recent days, we have, according to published reports, killed 2 American citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son, Abdul Raham, in Yemen, a country with which the United States is not at war, but is part of our ongoing global counterterrorism efforts. In the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, the President confirmed the airstrike that killed him, but the administration has not released its legal analysis that justified the action outside of a court of law and due process. Now, to be clear, his leadership role in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and participation in AQAP operational planning, not to mention his encouragement of further attacks against the United States, in my mind made him a clear threat to the United States and a legitimate target. I believe there was ample existing authorities to justify the action, but expressly because this involved an American citizen outside a declared war zone and without due process, the government, in my mind, is obligated to come forward with sufficient information to give the American people confidence the action was consistent with our laws of war and existing authorities. An unnamed administration official, as quoted in the Washington Post, characterized the death of his son as being in the wrong place at the wrong time, next to someone else who was the target of the U.S. strike. Again, the American people have a right to know whether the United States considered him a combatant, and if so, why? Or if not, whether the rules of engagement were properly followed with respect to harm to civilian bystanders. Now, I understand there is a debate underway within the administration regarding what, if anything, to say about these actions. We, as a government, have found ways in the past to inform the American people about sensitive security issues. For example, a public version of the National Intelligence Estimate regarding Iran a few years ago comes to mind as being a way in which we can have a classified version of a document and an unclassified version of a document that informs the American people appropriately about what the government is doing on their behalf. Surely the Obama administration, which pledged a high degree of transparency in government, can find a way to inform its citizens while protecting sensitive operational details. Now, another example where we are on the right track but must must make important adjustments regards connection technologies that are being misused and abused by autocratic governments, and some of those connection technologies have origins here in the United States. Working with the private sector and non-governmental organizations, the United States and the West needs to do more to curb this misuse. At the same time, these are tools that are definitely helping to transform these societies. The United States and the Obama administration have been strong advocates regarding freedom of expression, association, and assembly as they pertain not just to the physical world, but to the virtual world. Reflect again on the importance of the internet and social media that created the momentum for political, economic, and social change in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and hopefully Syria. One of the actions that discredited President Mubarak and led to his departure from office with the encouragement of the United States was his attempt to literally disconnect Egypt from the internet. Who knew he could do that? In contravention of international human rights law. We have work to do in this area since we have seen regimes use Western technologies that are intended to expand access to the internet to instead monitor and restrict the peaceful actions of their citizens and their access to legitimate information. These technologies by themselves, while they are broadly democratizing and clearly empower average citizens, they have the ability to upset the status quo, but not by themselves produce functioning democracies. But the combination of an empowered citizenry, a free and fair electoral system, open and transparent government institutions, and an inclusive and tolerant civil society, along with the presence of a vibrant and independent media, can in fact transform these countries. But these will be long transitions. They will require considerable outside support and advice, including from the United States. What does this all mean? We command the global stage, but technology has definitely largely removed the costs and barriers of entry into this ongoing global conversation. As the United States seeks to act, seeks to be heard, and most importantly, to be understood, there are many more competing voices, many more theater critics, if you will, who will influence global perceptions of the United States, our policies, and our actions. The temptation within government, the one I served in for 30 years, given this incredible complexity, is to communicate less. We need to communicate more. Actually, everything that we do communicates. What we do, what we don't do, what we say, what we don't say. Our friendships, our alliances, our willingness to join others in a common cause, and our determination at various times to go it alone. Some in government believe that our current struggle to be understood is just a matter of better messaging. That's too simplistic. Communicating is more than policy pronouncements. It's actually about policies themselves. Nation states no longer control the flow of information that can originate from anywhere, including a distant battlefield, and migrate to anywhere, including to WikiLeaks. Information empowers, and we should find ways to expand access to information even as we continue to protect information of importance to our national security. This sounds like a contradiction. It's not. To me, we have to do both. WikiLeaks or something like it will be part of the future foreign policy landscape. Governments will be challenged again, just as the United States was in this instance. Call it an unannounced test. How will we do? If we continue to engage the world in a respectful dialogue, deepen our understanding of each other, pursue shared interests, and act consistent with our laws, our values, and our interests, we will pass the next test just as we passed this one. Thank you very much.
We'll now open it up to questions from the audience. If you are here in Carlisle, please come up to the microphone. If you have a question in University Park, please press your button, and Mr. Crowley will be able to see when the camera zooms in to your spot. I'll stand over here and let you.
I thought there was a fight in the back row, and you, Pete, asked the first question.
So I'm a first-year law student here, but prior to that, I was in Washington, and I was the point person for Oxfam with the U.S. government on WikiLeaks and trying to protect the information that we provide on confidential humanitarian information to the United States government, that it wasn't going to come back on our staff while we're there. And it's kind of related to that issue. Since the war on terror, basically, humanitarian agencies have been in this position where we've been called force multipliers, where by Secretary of State Colin Powell, where the government relies upon information they get, because the wars are now people-centric, right? Rely upon people on the ground. And the U.S. government keep on coming to us to give them information, but it's understanding that it's confidential, and otherwise it would put all our staff at risk. In this new age with this communication, is it ever going to be possible again to do that? Are the walls going to be totally broken down, because these internet activists will always find a way to do that? Because it is very important that those sources are always protected.
It's a very good question. Does this represent inevitable age of transparency where there will be no secrets? I don't necessarily think that. I think that we'll see something like WikiLeaks again. There's this other entity now called OpenLeaks, has slightly different ground rules according to its founder, which is not necessarily to publish information willy-nilly, but to actually the information it gains, it will actually give to NGOs to evaluate whether this information merits disclosure or the risks of disclosure outweigh the benefits of its release. So I think that, can information be protected? The answer is yes. Thankfully, we don't have that many people who are, chasing people like Julian Assange to hand them a trove of information. There is an effort within government. It needs to be expanded to separate information from the sources. Much of the information that the government has, the information itself is, you read it and go, okay, I knew that. But it's where the information came from, and it's the source of the information that's actually the most sensitive issue in the file. And there is more effort to anonymize information so that information that can actually be declassified, so that you get the perspective and share that perspective across the government without putting the source of the information in jeopardy. Now, part of what we did with the New York Times was to say you can't just take out a particular name, because there's contextual information that, for a good security service, can still identify the person who provided the information. A good example of that would be China. When an American diplomat meets a Chinese citizen, we assume that there's somebody monitoring the date, the time, and the place of that conversation. And they can match, even with the lack of a name, can match the information with the database that tracks who's talking to who, when, where, and how. So we have to be careful about how this is done. But more and more, the key would be to separate the information, the source, share the information without jeopardizing the person who is, in many cases, and there are development workers who are the only people in certain countries. For a long time, we had World Food Program had some aid workers in North Korea, including some Americans. They were gaining insights about North Korea that the United States government had no means to have, since we have no embassy there. So the work of NGOs can be very important. NGOs can provide a useful perspective to policymakers, but obviously that's crucial. They need to be protected.
Hello, sir.
Hello there.
Hello, my name is Sally. I'm from the School of International Affairs, and it's so nice to hear you speak today. And I can't wait until you come to the University Park campus so we can all see you here.
I think I'm coming on November 8th.
Yeah, I saw that. So I wanted to ask, since we are in an academic setting, there was much talk about students and WikiLeaks and how perhaps when a student who is interested in a future career of the U.S. government views WikiLeaks, it could end up hurting their career, like from even taking off. What are your views on that? Do you know what
I know what you're talking about.
Current status about that? There was like so much confusion that I don't even know what the final word on that was and how that all began in the first place.
Just to put this in context, back in January, there was a rumor that came out of, I think, Columbia University, where a student was told by someone that if you go online and view the classified documents online, that you would not qualify for an appointment, in government service. We were never able to find out where that rumor started, and that rumor is totally untrue. No one in the government is tracking what you are looking at on your private computer. Now, there was another rumor that was equally confusing to us, or it was confusing when the media considered it. We did tell present U.S. government employees that you cannot look at a classified cable on your government unclassified computer. And a lot of people say, well, that's intimidating your own employees. Any government employee, any member of the State Department or anywhere else, if they go home at night, could click on the New York Times website and read away at all of the Dagestan wedding cable, the Gaddafi cable, whatever they wanted to. The issue was that in the desk I had at the State Department, where you have a classified computer and an unclassified computer, an unclassified computer is just that. You are not allowed to put classified information on that system. And if you download a message or a cable from the New York Times website into your unclassified system, you are violating government regulations. So we did tell government employees, don't look at these cables on your unclassified system. And eventually the computer wizards were able to work it so that if you even clicked on a classified cable on the New York Times website, it wouldn't let you do it. But rest assured, if you're studying WikiLeaks, you're not jeopardizing a future government career.
Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Look forward to seeing you.
Good evening, Professor Crowley. Given that the internet can be used for both dissemination of information and communication, which one do you think has a larger impact on global politics? Like, for example, WikiLeaks was an example of dissemination of information, whereas Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia is an example of the communicative power of social media.
Well, these are tools. So they can be used constructively, as with the Arab Spring, and they can be used destructively. Pick your issue, Al-Qaeda and its use of the internet to recruit people to blow themselves up. A perfect example of it's the same tool being used for two different purposes. As you look at the at the importance of technology, on the one hand, we do see that the internet, social media gives people access to information that empowers them, that inspires them, and that has sent many of them at great risk to themselves into the streets and Tahrir Square and other places day after day, knowing that they're going to get intimidated. In the case of the protesters in Syria, knowing they're going to get shot at. But they do that because they want a different kind of country and a different kind of society. So these tools have empowered these people, but by themselves they won't transform these countries. Eventually you need to put social media together with traditional media, together with effective institutions of government, responsible leadership, and time, to create a truly civil society and a genuine democracy. But certainly in terms of giving momentum to these movements, these are powerful tools, and that's why the autocratic governments are doing everything they can possibly do, to try to seal these things off. And the remarkable resiliency of these tools is on display in Syria. You don't have any traditional media in Syria, and yet through creative application of these tools, people have found ways to take a snippet of video on their cell phone, put it on the internet before it can be shut down. They've created virtual news networks using these tools, and as a result, we have a very good picture of what's happening within Syria. Now, these tools do not necessarily guarantee that Bashar al-Assad will be overthrown. He's going to carry on for at least a period of time. But you see the power of these tools and their potential, and we're seeing that transformation in these Arab transitions.
Hello, Professor.
Hello?
Yep. My name is Ernesto Alvarado. I am also of the School of International Affairs. You briefly talked about secrecy and the importance of secrecy and effective democracy. I just wanted to get your thoughts on what sort of, I guess, when does the government or the institution that runs a state its secrets have a detrimental effect on democracy in a country? So it's such a thin line to, I guess, walk.
I would say that to me it depends on the level of development. If you're moving from an autocracy to democracy, you want to try to be as open as possible. I do think that there is a point at which there can be too much openness. Probably, the Israeli-Palestinian situation would be a good example of if that negotiation, if and when it occurs, happens in public, there'll never be an agreement. So for a period of time, some secrecy is vital and necessary. In the context of a negotiation like the one that we hope will eventually happen between the Israelis and Palestinians, they have to sit there and bargain away rights that they feel very strongly that they've been entitled to on both sides going back decades. Neither country or neither leadership has prepared their citizens for principled compromise. And if these negotiations were to happen in the open, the negotiations would stop in their tracks. But obviously, at the point that an agreement is reached, then there has to be significant communication to gain the necessary political support to be able to carry out such an agreement. So, but I think that transparency, particularly as countries are going through difficult transitions, are vitally important for a number of reasons, but to make sure that the people trust those who are responsible for the transition. And you see this; these are difficult struggles. And in Egypt, there are still secret military courts, and people are wondering, whose side is the military transitional committee on? So, in that sense, the greater the transparency, the greater likelihood that those responsible for the transition can effectively gain and sustain public support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take these 2.
Hello. My question is, as far as I understand it, WikiLeaks was a one-time leak that was then released over this past year. And when that information runs out or even goes stale, do we think that we're going to see this again? Obviously, precautions have been taken to a larger extent, but how do we know if it's going to happen again, or what precautions are being taken other than the globalization? Knowing what's happening in social media, classified documents seem to be a different case.
As I understand it, this was one person, but it probably took him some time to download the trove onto the infamous Lady Gaga disc. There are people who are going to periodically take information that's classified and give it to somebody who's not entitled to have it. That happens. I think hopefully the last thing we'll see again is something of this magnitude, God willing. I would say that there were clearly security breaches that should have prevented this from happening. Ironically, this was State Department information in this last tranche. This was, State Department work provided to the Pentagon, and what happened in Iraq could actually not happen in the State Department networks. The computer at my desk was disabled so that I couldn't put a thumb drive into it and download anything. Unfortunately, that feature, while it was military protocol to disable that feature for that particular computer, it did not happen. And also, there should have been oversight of the network so that an unusual event, an unusual movement of information should have been detected, and it wasn't. At the time I left the department and the government, a lot of corrective measures had already been instituted and were being further implemented. But we are going to have a situation where, given the combination of technology and digitized information, this stuff is going to migrate. So can it happen again? It can. Creative minds being what they are, they'll find a way to do it. But I think that that's one of the reasons why the prosecution, in my mind, is very important. There has to be a deterrent and a signal sent to those who are responsible for protecting information. If you do it, there will be consequences.
When the State Department appeals to the New York Times to refrain from publishing, whether it be the Pentagon Papers or WikiLeaks here, there's a certain agreement to a tacit social contract there that makes that effective. In the case, as we've just seen lately, as some people in the New York Police Department choose not to abide by the social contract, we have a problem then, and then we can prosecute them because they're still here. But in the case where there is no social contract around the world, as we have in WikiLeaks, what do you foresee as a realistic enforcement mechanism in some type of sanction against somebody who, has no agreement to the social contract?
Let me clarify. The sanction against the media or sanction against?
In any, do we sanction? How can we sanction Al Jazeera if they publish things that were released through WikiLeaks? Is there a realistic enforcement mechanism? Otherwise, what's the purpose?
It's an excellent question, and let me give you a real-world example. In January in Pakistan, there was a government operative who was stopped at a stoplight. Two individuals on motorcycles came up behind him and, in his mind, threatened him. This guy took out his 6 shooters and shot both of them dead. He was arrested by the Pakistani authorities. For a period of time, he was held in a jail cell in Lahore, Pakistan. There were a number of demonstrators outside the jail cell who wanted access to him so they could rip him apart. I got a call from a 3-letter agency that said, he's our guy. but we really, really, really need you to give us, but he's under your cover, but he's our guy. Would you make sure that the New York Times doesn't publish the fact that he works for a 3-letter agency? I went, oh, great. I called the managing editor of the New York Times and made that request. I said, look, right now there are people outside his cell who test his food because they don't trust that, they trust that somebody's trying to poison him. The last thing we need is to get, we need a little bit of time to get this guy out. And if his actual duties in Pakistan are published, we think he'll be put in additional jeopardy. Bill Keller agreed to do that as long as no other news outlet published that information. And that agreement with the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and others held for about 9 days. Eventually, there was a report from Pakistan that was picked up in the United States that identified the agency that he was working for. And at that point, we released all of the media from their agreement. And we were very grateful that we had a 9-day period to try to negotiate his departure. It took longer. He eventually was handed over to the United States. Bill Keller said later he received an enormous amount of grief within his circle for making that agreement. But I thought it's not something that I did on behalf of the United States government lightly, and I knew that I was requesting something of the New York Times, and the New York Times was under no obligation to honor that request. But that was consistent with the approach that the New York Times took to the documents in WikiLeaks. Anything that was going to put real people at risk, the New York Times backed off that reporting. That, to me, is the best that you can do. That is what a responsible news organization does. Now, different organizations had different standards. I had a daily conversation with the New York Times, and we worked out arrangements in a business-like fashion. I had occasional conversations with The Guardian. I had occasional conversations with other major media. Some would listen to us, some would not. Some had standards, some did not. I think it undoubtedly helped us that the New York Times sat in our country. We have a daily relationship with them, and they thought that that relationship was of sufficient value that they were willing to make some concessions where they felt that there was a real risk to life and limb. So there is an understanding, but it's not a contract. In a society, the importance of a free and independent media to report responsibly and occasionally to report irresponsibly is vitally important. And at the end of the day, if the United States were to step in and try to sanction any news organization, whether it's New York Times on the one hand or Al Jazeera on the other, I think would be a colossal mistake. Now, Al Jazeera, is it a perfect news organization? There is no such thing as a perfect news organization. But in a region of state-controlled media, is Al Jazeera an advance? It is an enormous advance, and you saw that in the Al Jazeera's coverage of the activity in Tahrir Square. It was genuinely, vitally important. And at various times, the Egyptian government was going after Al Jazeera physically to try to shut them down. Now, Al Jazeera's got some work to do. On the one hand, they were aggressive in their reporting of Egypt. They've been fairly benign in their reporting of Bahrain. So there's some politics there that needs to be worked out over time. But in terms of a trajectory and in terms of the importance of having as genuine independent media as exists in that region, I think that it's important to support Al Jazeera as it continues to advance.
Thank Thank you for your remarks tonight, and also I need to commend PJ on staying between the ferns. I told him that he had to, he tends to wander, and I know he would much prefer to be in the audience and among you all responding to the questions, but because
At the War College,
the,
let me wander all over the place.
because of the recording, I told him he had strict geographic limits this evening. So please, I hope you'll join us for the reception afterwards in the common area, and again, thank you. We look forward to many more conversations like this across the next year.